There's in the back if you don't have one. This color. Again, welcome to this last part of the series on the church life in the church, and talking about the parish and parish life. And the handout will be helpful to you. Keep following that to read. A couple of good books that I'm recommending in relationship to, I don't know how many have read. The Emerging Parish, that's a lot of the statistics that are in my handout are drawn from this book. It's a very extensive study of Catholic parishes in the United States. Joseph Gramillion and Jim Castelli. It really is an excellent study, and it has a lot of up-to-date figures. How many people have read this book? I know this book. Well, it deserves a wider reading, and people who are involved in parish life would do well to look that over. The other one is called The Christian Parish by William Bausch. I mentioned that. That's all in the handout. Bill Bausch is a tremendous pastor and writes out of his experience. And a lot of what I, again, have in the notes are taken from Bill Bausch's work. How many people have read this book? Bill would not be happy. Other ones, yeah, he has written a number of other ones. I mean, he's a terrific pastor. I use his stories a lot of times. I guess as I start out with talking about the challenges and everything, it's good to remember that things are pretty healthy in the Catholic parishes today. In fact, as you read this book, if you're feeling down, you get a lot of hope. When they actually study the thing and look at what's happening and get people's responses, it really is quite amazing. I quote that stat in the introduction. 85% of the people say that their parish meets their spiritual needs either completely or very well. And that's remarkable. I mean, there are not many institutions doing that well, and that's sort of really opposed to what the general viewpoint is, I suppose, or what most people think is happening. You know, most people say, well, it's not going well, and so on, and that we're not making progress, and people are unhappy, and so on. So that's maybe something that to keep in mind as I go through this, because I am going to talk about it in terms of problem areas and challenges, but there is a general health. And then in that study, what they surveyed was the people who are registered in parishes. There's about 53 million of people like that. And when you see statistics quoting Catholics, this is what changes the stats. In other words, there's about 67 million people who say they're Catholic. And about 53 million of those people are registered in parishes. Now, this whole study by Gramillion and Castelli is of the 53 million. That's the group that they did their study on. And then they did an intensive study of about 30-some different parishes around the country to come up with some of their data as well. And I think the study is generally well respected. And then that's why sometimes you'll hear it said that Catholics are 28% of the population of the United States, and other times it'll say 25%. I think that's the difference. In the same way with Mass attendance, you'll see a striking figure in here that 73% of these Catholics go to Mass weekly. Well, I mean, the other stats we hear are quite different, and it depends on whether you're sort of thinking of the 67 million or the 53 million. So there's 53 million who are registered in parishes, and all the stats in the paper that you got are from that sampling. They don't include whatever the other number of million are thinking about parish life and so on. So we'll start out by trying to think of the challenges that we're faced with and what it is that people are looking for. So first of all, a lot of it has to do with the personnel. So the first kind of challenge that I think that we face in parish life is how are we going to get more people involved? How are we going to get more people to feel co-responsible for the parish, not only to feel it, but to do something about it? That remains a major interest for all of us. And again, as I say that, I think it's important to remember, I mean, that's us, the parish, this isn't just a lecture for leaders, but for all of us, just because we're all somehow co-responsible for these parishes that we belong to. So that's the first thing. And then there really is a tension involved in that. And the tension is, are these people that we're going to want to be more involved, are we trying to get them to be more involved in the life of the parish, on justice committees and liturgy committees, or are we trying to get them more involved in the life in the world? So we find a tension when we're trying to renew our parishes along that line. And then the other people that we're interested in are the leaders in the community. Again, large numbers of those people are lay people. About 83% of the leaders are lay people. High percentage are women. And so the question here is, how do we get the leaders, those of us who are in those positions, to be more servant leaders, modeled on Jesus Christ, and trying to live out his way of being a leader, where he said you're not supposed to lord it over, but you're supposed to try to facilitate and enable and help other people to grow and develop. And so here we find a certain tension as well, and that is between those leaders who are ordained and those who are not. And sometimes the tension gets sharpened when priests don't like certain people taking over leadership in the parishes. Sometimes those who are the leaders but are not ordained feel frustrated because they know they're the real leader and they want to be recognized as such, and that bothers them. And so we find a tension again among the ordained and non-ordained leaders. Now, I try to look at this leadership question more carefully here in the notes. We see we're going to have a lot less priests before long. That's going to cause certain difficulties. Then I'm talking about, and again, this is borrowed from that book, The Emerging Parish, where they talk about the perception gap. And they found it very interesting when they surveyed what the pastors said and the leaders said and what the parishioners were saying. And so a perfect example of that is that in many parishes, the people do not know what the pastor thinks about birth control. They assume that he is espousing the line of the Vatican on birth control, whereas very often they don't. But the people simply assume that they do. And the priests, I guess, don't make their viewpoints clear on that. That's one way we see this perception gap. The other way is that where the pastors, if they ask them, they say, well, do you share your decision-making power and give other people responsibility and so on? And he answers, well, yes, of course, very often in many ways. And if you ask the parishioners that same question, they say, no, he runs the whole show. He does everything himself. So that's part of it. There's many of these gaps in perception that they uncovered in this study. Then we got another leadership problem in terms of women. So women are doing most everything in the parishes in large numbers. They are, as the study says, the backbone of parishes. As you can see, I mean, large numbers. They're the most influential leaders, people say, 80% of the CCD teachers and so on. And a lot more figures that I didn't include in there. But the problem is, while they are the perceived leaders in all of those ways, they don't occupy the highest leadership positions, and that therefore they are in some tension along this line. And then we have the pastor separation anxiety, as it's called. This is when you have good pastors. And in the old days, I mean, pastors stayed around a long time. And you had these pastors in parishes that were irremovable, the irremovable pastor. And so there was no worry about him being gone. But today, when the people like the pastor, they know he's going to move pretty soon. And that causes a lot of anxiety, and they trying to figure out what to do with the transition period and so on. And then we have still a lot of leaders acting in authoritarian fashion, as it suggests here. Or, on the other hand, not being strong enough, not being decisive, not making decisions. letting things drift too much, afraid to take a stand. And so people will say, well, what does this parish stand for? What does the leadership stand for? The people would really have no idea. And then another difficulty is what's often called the new elitism. That is, we now have people who have trained and have master's degrees in pastoral work and so on, and we're in danger of setting up sort of a new class that wants to run things again, and maybe haven't learned the whole method of participation or dialogue along the way. I was sort of feeling about that I would think that I would like to see more feeling in the rest of the parish in helping those people. I believe that we would be better off if that sort of new leadership that's emerging, if there was a greater sensitivity to their problems. I mean, very often they don't have a lot of experience in doing this. Very often they're just learning what it means to be the leaders in the parish. And especially I think this goes for women. And I guess I was liking to see more people sensitive to the problems they have in learning to be good leaders. I mean, I saw this in dealing with the bishops. I felt that when I interacted with the bishops and writing the pastoral letter on campus ministry and interacted with a lot of other people at the time, what you found out was that the bishops were great dialoguers, great at small groups, great in meetings. They know how to keep their mouths shut, how to ask questions at the right time. They had to. I mean, they've been forced to it over and over and over again. And they're good at it. And but what you find is that a lot of other people who are in the newly emerged leadership in the church haven't learned that over a period of time. They often haven't been forced to do it. And so I think all of us need a greater sensitivity to those people and to give them a chance and to be in dialogue with them and help them along this way. What they find out is that in leadership positions, very often it is the quite progressive or the quite conservative who really work to get in those positions and take them over. And therefore we have a potential for a tension between those two groups. We have a need for continuing education for all the leaders in the church and so on. Okay, the next thing in the handout is dealing with the size question. We almost always think of that as parishes are too large, and what are we going to do about that? And there certainly are a lot of them. There's also a lot of parishes that seem to be too small. In other words, they don't have a very wide range of services. If they study those very small parishes, they have Mass on Sunday and maybe some sort of a program, a CCD program for the grade school kids. And beyond that, they don't find a lot of programming. So that becomes a tension here, as we'll see later on, between the small and the large. Large parishes got their own kind of problems, being impersonal, people don't know one another, and so on. And then we, of course, have the Detroit situation that we're so aware of here. You have the urban parishes, they're falling off numbers, and they can't support them, and then there's decisions made to close them, and so on. So a lot of problems connected with the size. And then what they found out in the study is that quite an amazing number of Catholics today, these registered Catholics, have really caught the spirit of Vatican II. I mean, a lot of times I think we forget that, but when they check them out to see which of the models of the church they most are in tune with, and they give them a choice like between an institutional model and the people of God model, very high percentage favor the more communal model, 7-to-1. I mean, that's quite remarkable, and that's what you see again in the survey of how well we have done in getting across the major ideas of Vatican II. Now, I know a lot of people say, hey, I don't know what parishes they surveyed, but it doesn't seem to fit. And I don't really know what to make of it. I'm usually not this caught up in stats, as people know. I seldom use them and so on, but they're so striking to me, and I guess we'll have to figure out if we really buy into them or not. But what happens is, as soon as people see they're the people of God, then they have rising expectations. They want to run things, they want to have responsibility, they want to have more democratic procedures, etc. And they want more services. They expect more from the parish. And it's very often hard to do. And the things they want, most of all, have to do with family life. They want good education programs for the kids. They want parent education. They want more efforts to deal with the divorced people, separated, those who are remarried. And they want more help with dealing with the major social problem of drugs, especially preventing their kids from getting involved in drugs. So there's a whole raft of new things that people are wanting from parishes, and the parishes and the leaders in the parishes are sitting there saying, well, how the heck are we going to do all of this? I mean, we're up to here now. We can't possibly start one more program. How are we going to manage all of this? Then there's the whole area of social justice, so on. Interesting sort of idea that when they see, what is it that you think the parish ought to be doing? Helping poor people is right up there near the top. Very close to the whole idea even of educating the people in the parish. I think it's the second one. Now that is again remarkable to many people, that there's that much interest in parish and helping poor people, but that's the poor people within the parish boundaries. When it starts talking about the poor elsewhere in the country or in other neighborhoods or around the world, this goes way down, and people are not as interested in doing that. I suppose the sort of frightening idea is that there's a lot of lip service to the social justice dimension. As you can see, a lot of people say, well, yeah, ought to really work change on structures and so on, but something only like about 4% involved in the parish programs to work on that. Now, that could be skewed in a lot of one way is that maybe a lot of people do their social justice work through other streams, through civic involvement, social community, all that. That's not our way, I don't know what to make of the 4%, but that means that's a very small percentage of people who really would involved in social justice, social outreach, and so on. Look at that other figure about the supporting the bilateral nuclear free, 92%. I mean, that's incredible. Even the pollsters couldn't believe it. I guess they had to check it out, that figure. And again, there might be reasons for it and why it came out that way, but that really is quite remarkable. And a lot of times we feel, again, if I preach a homily in various places to give a talk on the nuclear question, the peace and war thing, by the responses that you get, you have the feeling like about half the Catholics out there are what we call nationalistic hawks. They want more for weapons, and by golly, they want this and that, and they're mad about the peace pastoral and so on. And yet, the survey shows that only 8% of those really are in favor of the Catholics, core Catholics as they're called, are in favor of more defense spending. Now, that is very important for us to remember because you can really get pulled down by thinking that we got a whole bunch of Catholics who haven't caught the social justice message at all, and I don't think that's really the case. But what happens, of course, is that they're more vocal. I mean, if I go give a talk someplace on the peace pastoral and the people who agree with me don't come up and say, hey, that was terrific. I mean, the people who are vocal and are upset, write me letters afterwards and so on, obviously oppose what the bishops have to say. But it's a smaller number than maybe we might think. Then we have the whole question of education. And here I think the tension very often exists between the effort put into the school and into the CCD program. I mean, a woman called me not long ago saying that she sends her kids to the public school and they got a Catholic school there and they did almost nothing for her kid, that her kid always feels like an outsider in First Communion preparation and so on. And she's looking for more effort on the CCD. It's not happening, and therefore she's very upset about that, what's she going to do for her youngsters. So I think there is a tension very often. The great challenge, of course, is to figure out how to give a broad-based educational program so that all segments of the parish are sort of drawn into the thing. And then when we talk about improving the liturgy and so on, I think here the tension that I sense is between what I call the liturgical purists and those who are more into relevant liturgies. So the purists say, well, we don't need gimmicks and we don't need themes and we don't need special highlights of the liturgy and so on. Just do it right and have good homilies and good readers, and that's the way you work. So on Mother's Day, you wouldn't play up mothers, but you would play up whatever the scripture readings are of the day. So that would be a good test case. I mean, well, how would you deal with the special holidays like Memorial Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, things like that? And on one side, the purists say, well, just go with what the scripture readings say. Oh, and then the more relevant people are saying, no, we have to adapt, we have to work with what's going on in the culture, got to use different forms, sometimes shake up the order of things, do things differently, have highlights, and so on. So it appears as though there's a real tension when we're trying to figure out how to make the liturgies better. And of course, that's what we are about. I mean, most people think we have to reform, improve our whole liturgical celebration, but the real question is, how do you go about that? And I think, I mean, as I read the literature, I mean, it depends what day you ask me which side I'm on. I mean, some days it seems to me that it's really important to be relevant and gear into where people are at and make it more folksy and so on. And other days, you had to write Aidan Kavanaugh, a great spokesman for the purists. And say, well, that's not what good liturgy is. It's ritual, and the sameness is important. Do the same way. Don't surprise people when they come to church. Make sure always orderly and fixed. That's really what counts. There's days when you read Campbell and you ask how it really works, and I'm ready to say, yeah, you're right about that. So in my own mind, I haven't really solved that particular tension. And I suppose most of these tensions I'm talking about, I'm not sure they are totally solvable. In fact, one of the great notes about Parish Life, I think, is that the tensions are finally healthy. That I'm sort of glad. I mean, I got a marvelous letter when we, during this last time after Easter, we tried to improve our liturgy and get people to think about it. And one of our Christians wrote me a marvelous letter saying, well, that's not the way you do it. It's, that's not how it ought to be done, because it was a sort of representing the liturgical purist line. I mean, I think I'd really like to hear that. And I'm trying to read up more on that line of thought these days myself. So, but these tensions, I think, are fundamentally healthy, as I see it anyway. And then the other kind of thing that we're involved in throughout all of this is helping people in the parish to achieve personal growth. And I suppose the tension I perceive here is between getting real involved in the self-actualization thing and how we're going to fulfill ourselves, and on the other hand, how we're going to be involved in the community, caring about the public good, and so on. Well, that's, as I see some of the challenges that maybe we want to look at. There's other ones here that I didn't really comment on. Under the liturgical thing, I mentioned a number of other factors involved. One of the things that struck me is it's commonly said that the great watchers of the televangelists are Catholics, and the great contributors to them are Catholics. And the survey says among the core Catholics that's clearly not the case. And I quote the stats here, only 6% watching Billy Graham. I suppose you could say it's a large percentage, but the claims were that, high percentage of the watchers of the televangelists were Catholics and giving them all their money and so on, and not contributing to the parishes. It doesn't seem as though that's really the case. And the other thing is that despite a whole long history of heavy images of God and a lot of fear about moralism and hell and damnation, that the Catholic people have, by and large, have tremendously healthy notions of God. God is seen as loving, as caring, as the Father. Haven't caught up much with the maternal images of God. Very low percentage really are into the maternal images of God. But the dominant images are definitely positive. And as I suggested here in the notes, only a small percentage really think of God as somehow vindictive or harsh and so on. Again, that's totally opposed to what the general perception is, at least among leaders, that we've got a whole bunch of Catholic people with heavy moralistic thinking. And we do see changes among age groups here. One is like how people pray. There's definitely among younger people a lack of devotion, say, to Mary and the saints. very different from older people. Okay, that is an attempt to get into the challenges of all this. And what I want you to do now is to turn to a partner and spend a couple minutes, ask yourself what the challenges of your own parish are and how you might begin to do those. Let's take a couple minutes now. I want to move into the historical section of all of this. I find this fascinating. It's important for us to know our root, I think, in terms of parish life. The whole thing began, Jesus didn't set up a bunch of parishes. They gradually, this whole thing spread. Christianity was centered in big cities, and bishop was the bomb, and it all revolved around the bishop in the large cities, Antioch and Jerusalem, Rome, and so on. Well, eventually, as they got more numbers, they handled all that. Bishop had presbyters who often lived with him or in the same place, and they'd go out and help these other smaller things because the bishop couldn't go all those places. In fact, we still have a remnant of mass of the whole practice of what the bishop used to do was to break off a piece of the host from the mass he celebrated and give it to those presbyters who would then take it out symbolically to the other group so to show they were all in communion. We still have a remnant of them in the mass of that when we break the host and play in a little portion and place it in the chalice. So it was all thought of, it all revolved really around the diocese. And of course, as time went on then, these other presbyters out there became the pastors, and those other areas became what we come to know as the parishes. And in the Middle Ages, you had a lot of trouble because the feudal lords ran those areas, and therefore they wanted to run the parishes, so you had a big conflict between the secular order and the church. We call it, that's connected with the lay investiture movement. People remember some of that history, perhaps. And 11th century got very intense between the Pope and King Henry IV, Pope Gregory VII, big fight over who was really going to control those parishes. The king and the vassals, the lords, or the bishops and the Pope. And for a long time, it really was in the hands of the secular authorities, even after they worked out some sort of an agreement at Concordat of Worms, as it's called. Well, turn now to the history in the United States, and what you see is that the great involvement of the laity in the parishes. The laity are the ones who started the parishes, often owned the parishes, determined how they were run, and there weren't that many priests around. And so in the early times of the settlers over here, the people would gather in their families or in little neighborhood groupings like. And the priest was like a circuit rider. He would move around and come and stop in now and then and have mass for the people. But the whole thing ran with the laity. What is interesting as I go through this history is just think about what we're going through now. I mean, when we priests start being circuit riders, and not too many years from now, we will have had repeating history again. Because the first priests in the United States were circuit riders. They went around all these different places. And then the lay people, as the immigrants came in, then vast numbers, as we know, I mean, unbelievable numbers of Catholic immigrants, first from Ireland and Germany, then later on from Poland and Italy and other Eastern European countries. Now the people took hold. Again, there weren't the priests around, and so it was always the lay people who took hold, established the parishes, and then they'd go look for some priest to come in, and they'd hire him to come in and take care of the parish. And that began what we know as the whole movement of lay trusteeism. Let me just cite you an example of how this was done right in our own state of Ohio. This is down in Cincinnati, and it's in 1844. So this is how the thing gets started. The people in this one, what they call over the Rhine area, it's Little Germany in Cincinnati, decided that they wanted to have a parish. So they had an organizational meeting, October 1844, in a German church over nearby. A building committee of 10 laymen were chosen. They proceeded to draft a constitution outlining the procedures for building the church. At another public meeting, they ratified a constitution for the church, picked the name, St. John the Baptist. They purchased the land for the parish. And then they voted on such issues as the maximum price to be paid for the property, the number of doors in the churches, the thickness of its walls, size of its windows. A collection committee was set up, public meetings to solicit the funds. And March 25th, 1845, they laid the cornerstone for this church. They planned the whole ceremony for involving it, the ceremony, procession, accompanying festivities, and so on. Dedicated the church. And while this was all going on, they decided to build a school as well. And everything, as they said, was agreed to and carried out with the accustomed meetings. So not only do you have the lay people doing all of this, but you have them involved in very democratic procedures, voting on how they're going to do it and so on. This is 1840s here in the United States. This is how our parishes began. It's a really interesting history. And the same thing was repeated. The Germans very big on this, and the other groups as well. We'll see a different story with the Irish churches as we go along here. Now, this, of course, there was a lot of difficulty. This was not a smooth thing that went on here. There was a lot of conflict when you got into this lay trusteeism because the bishops didn't like it. Because the bishops wanted to control. I mean, they didn't like it that the lay people were picking the pastors and firing them as well. And they didn't like it that the lay people owned all of the land that the churches were on. So this set up certain conflicts. Sometimes the bishops, in fact, had to excommunicate whole parishes or place them under interdict. In Philadelphia, there's a famous story. This is in the 1820s. In this city of brotherly love, the Irish parishioners of St. Mary's, the city's principal Catholic parish, went to battle over the issue of authority. The trustees, those are the lay people in charge now, claimed the right to appoint and dismiss their priests. And the bishop denied them such claims. Conflict erupted periodically during a 20-year period. They're fighting this thing, reaching a high point in the 1820s when opposing factions of people and priests battled one another for control of the parish. Bitter pamphlet wars ensued. They each write their own pamphlets and pass them out. This is in Philadelphia, 1820s. There were tumultuous parish meetings, big fights and arguments, and even a riot in 1822. Irish Catholics armed with clubs and bricks fought one another in the front of the church. 200 people were injured over this whole thing. As one Philadelphia lawyer had put it, Catholics had turned the temple of religion into a place of tumult, riot, and bloodshed. So this whole business of lay trusteeism was not without its conflicts. Now, in certain areas, it seemed to work very well. In Charleston, West Virginia, where Bishop John England had a very enlightened policy, things flowed very smoothly, and he was very happy with it. In fact, the Catholic historian J. Dolan says that, contrary to popular opinion, a lot of lay trusteeism really ran quite well. Now, the Irish had a very different idea of all this. They weren't so much into lay trusteeism because they had a great love for the clergy. I mean, they were more into authoritarian ways. It's interesting, you know, most of the bishops were Irish. In fact, still today, the biggest percentage of parish leaders are Irish background. Well, the Irish had a very different sense of this. They wanted the priest to be in charge, and they looked to the priest to run things and to keep it all going. They tell the story of a famous pastor, Irish pastor in Chicago, Morris Dorney, an American-born Irishman. In 1880, he founded the parish of St. Gabriel on the south side of Chicago, the Stockyards district. He remained the pastor of that parish until his death in 1914. Pastor a long time. He was known as the king of the Stockyards. There's a legend that says he was one of these brick and mortar priests. He built everything. He built a church, and then he built a rectory and a convent, and he built a school. Oh, and what he did is he went around trying to keep everything in order. He was often called upon to arbitrate the labor disputes of the times. He acted as an employment agent, getting people jobs. Single-handedly kept the saloons off residential streets in the neighborhood. Periodically, Dorney would mount the pulpit to remind his parishioners that he was indeed king of the arts and pastor of the parish. So there's where we get a different sense now of the lay people were not running St. Gabriel's in Chicago. The pastor, the Irish pastor, was definitely in charge of this whole situation. Now we have another situation now here in Chicago. This is St. Stanislaus Parish, founded in 1867. From the very beginning, conflict divided the community. One group was sort of a nationalist. They were more into Americanism. The other group was more into Catholicism and maintaining that part of it. Well, they got into a big fight, and eventually the group split. The nationalists founded a new church. The priests of St. Stanislaus, however, didn't like this, so they tried to take over. The people would not allow it. For the next 20 years, the two groups fought. One priest walked the neighborhood armed with a pistol. People rioted in the streets and demonstrated in church, throwing hymnals, yelling and stamping their feet. Several times the parish was closed by the bishop. Finally, the people appealed their case to Rome. In a surprise move, the Vatican authorities supported the dissidents in Holy Trinity Parish. That's 1890s. And in 1893, the parish was turned over to the Holy Cross priest from Notre Dame to run the place. Pastor of Holy Trinity Parish remained there then for the next 55 years as the pastor. So we see some things here that are a little difficult at times. Sometimes it was very hard on the priests. They would get appointed to these places. This happened in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where they really did not like the priest who was sent to them. And 100 Slovak women in St. Cyril and Methodius Parish marched on the rectory, broke down the door, and chased the newly appointed pastor into the attic where he barricaded himself. The problem, as the lady saw it, was that the priest, Gaspar Ponick, was appointed by the bishop against their wishes. This is our history, ladies and gentlemen. It's very interesting kind of history. So, this was sort of the conflict that was going on between the laity and the episcopacy and over control of parishes here in the United States. By and large, founded by lay people. And what happened over a period of time, by 1900, the bishops had assumed almost total control. By 1900, the bishops were running things, and they owned the land. They had gotten rid of the last of the vestries or lay trustees, and they now had the power to appoint priests to parishes. Still, sometimes the people didn't like it and would be rebellious, but the bishops definitely had assumed the power to decide which priests were going to go where. Now, the next thing that we might note is the whole nativist prejudice that the Catholics had to deal with here. And again, this history is often not understood or remembered by people. It really is, Arthur Schlesinger once said that it is the most enduring prejudice in the United States, nativism. Nativism was the prejudice of the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants against the Catholics. The Catholics were the upstarts. They were coming into their country, messing up their cities, having too many kids, drinking too much, etc. And they were trying to, get beyond all this. They even formed a political party to try to deal with these Catholics based on anti-Catholicism, known as the Know-Nothings. And then I recount some of the difficulties here that the Catholics really had, and I mean, again, this is, not kidding around. In fact, one time I was in Birmingham, Alabama, and they showed me a parish that had been burned down by the nativists. And then there's the story of Father James Coyle, who had the audacity to celebrate a mixed marriage, a marriage of a Catholic and a Protestant. And an irate minister in the community came up to him and shot him, killed him for this, and this is in 1921 that we're talking about here. As late as the 1920s in Oregon, they tried to get rid of the Catholic schools by passing a law in the state of Oregon that every child had to go to the public school. This was a way of ridding themselves of the divisive influence of Catholic schools. It was then overturned by the Supreme Court in 1925, but here we had a state law. So there has been really a great deal of prejudice. And of course, we remember, many of us in the room, 1960, when it came out again, when John Kennedy ran for president, and all of these charges that Kennedy could not be a good president because he would have his first allegiance to Rome, and so on. And a great deal of that prejudice came out at that time. Kennedy's famous talk to the Houston ministers during the campaign helped turn a lot of that around. And interestingly enough, as you might remember, many of the southern states ended up voting for Kennedy. I noted someplace in these notes that there was a counter trend. There was also places and cities where Protestants helped Catholics in different ways to build churches or establish schools and so on. And again, interestingly enough, some of that did happen in the South, where people seemed to be able to get along, at least in some places like that. So what this did was set the tone for the parish. What that meant was that parishes became defensive enclaves. They became places where you went to get away from the nativist prejudice, to feel at home, to gear yourself up. It became vitally important for the Catholics to have their own schools because the public schools really were Protestant schools in the United States. And the Catholics were afraid, for example, they would force them to read the King James Version of the Bible, which the Catholics didn't want to do, and so on. And so there was this general brand of Protestantism taught there. So naturally, it forced a defensive attitude on the parts of Catholics. The parishes were a way of forming an isolated ghetto. You could be with those of your own kind, and you didn't have to deal with these people who didn't like you anyway. You had to deal with them enough at work in different situations, but now you could come together. The school was a vitally important part of that, a way to pass on the heritage, but also to keep the Catholic children from being infested with the Protestantism taught in the public schools. Now, the other thing that is worth noting here is the whole idea of the national parishes, which really grew up in the second half of the 19th century. National parishes were people of all one nationality went to them. And they often kept the old language from the old country, preached sermons that way, the liturgy was familiar, and was a way for people to hang on to their customs. Large percentage of those, I just talking about the northeastern part of the United States, 21% of them by 1930 were national parishes. So what you had in a diocese was sort of a mosaic of territorial parishes side by side with these national parishes. So any Irish in the city could go to the Irish parish. It wasn't just because you lived in the territorial boundaries of that parish. I mentioned already the founding of the schools. The Council of Baltimore, worried about this whole thing in 1884, mandated every parish to have an elementary school. And they wanted to do it within 2 years. Well, it was a little unrealistic, but they did reach something like 40% rather quickly of parishes that did have their own schools. And then there's the whole idea of the parish missions. A lot of people in the room remember parish missions. And an interesting way to think about those is in connection with the whole revivalist tendency in the United States. We have been a religious country like probably no few others. I shouldn't say no others, but few others. I mean, we've had, it's been a country with a religious soul, as is said. And periodically throughout our history, we've had these great awakenings or religious revivals. I think I put in the notes someplace, when those happened, just often connected with Jonathan Edwards, a great Protestant theologian in the United States who helped start those by his preaching back in the 1700s. So we've had all these religious revivals. Well, I've often thought that that was sort of a Protestant phenomenon. And the whole revivals were based on getting people to feel sinful. You're terrible, crummy people. That's Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon of sinners in the hands of an angry God. And the people are like suspended over hell by just a thread. You realize that? You people are just over hell by a thread, and that thread could get cut just like that. And you would be damned to the fires of hell. Well, and then there was always the positive message. What? Christ, through his atoning blood, has saved you from this terrible thing. You can be saved. And you come forward now and commit yourself to Christ, be born again. Well, I guess, there's an assumption that that was true in the Protestant world. But we had our own revivals in the Catholic Church. And they were the parish missions. And they functioned the same way. The same dynamics. Let me just read you a sermon here. This is not Jonathan Edwards. It was based on trying to get people to feel sinful. I think these missions really got started like around 1830 and took off after that. And were still popular way up into the 50s, 1950s, before the council. Parish missions. And so here's one example of a homily given at a parish mission. Very sin-oriented. He said, sin has given the death blow to your immortal soul. You have drawn down upon yourself the anger and punishment of the living God. A God who in his just vengeance is lawful and terrible. That he it is who cast forever into hell the holy angels when they first rebelled against him. That alas, many of the damned who are now groaning in the eternal pains of hell have not committed so great and so many sins as you. Now, what were these sins that they were so worried about? Two major sins. Now, this is interesting, too. Well, everyone knows one. But the other one is drunkenness. A lot of worry about that. A lot of feeling that that was the cause of a lot of the problems. Drunkenness was a big sin to be worried about. And, of course, the other one is the whole area of sexual immorality and the sin of impurity. And the great feeling that people had to, preach against all of this and to help people to overcome it. So, great sense of sinfulness pervaded. And the missions were really the parish revivals. They were the way that people were taught their religion. They became a major source of information for people, of instruction in their faith, and also produced what we would call devotional Catholicism. Now, in the early church, in early parishes in the United States, it was very liturgically centered. Churches were spare, not many statues or anything like that. The liturgy was sort of the center of it. This is under Bishop John Carroll at the beginning, around the time of the Revolution and so on. And it's sort of a solid, more solid theological preaching. Now, the missions came along and produced what we would call devotional Catholicism. Not so centered on the Mass and the sacraments, but all these other devotions, like benediction, and devotion to the Sacred Heart, and novenas, and devotions to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And those became the real substance of the Catholic faith. And it was done that way because they were seen as the only way you could ward off the sinful tendencies and the great temptations of this world. The world often was seen as a bad place. Now there's a counterpoint to this. It's found in the great bishops of the 19th century. The great bishops of the 19th century saw something good about American culture. They thought the democracy and the freedom and the growth and the things that were going on in the culture were fundamentally good, and they wanted to baptize that and bring it in and make and Americanize the parishes. But then there was this other tendency, which was much more defensive, much more ghettoized, created by the parish missions. A whole lot of our understanding of the faith and our piety, really, our whole sensibility, I think, comes from the power of these missions. And it puts us very much in the same background or milieu as our Protestant friends, because of their whole history with the revivals and so on. Number 7 in the outline, I talk about the whole idea of creativity in American parishes. I talked about that last week in relationship to pluralism, Pope Leo XIII's condemnation of the heresy of Americanism, 1899, and too much buying into the culture and forgetting the important Catholic values, and then the condemnation of modernism, cleaning out of Dunwoody Seminary in New York, suppressing of the journal produced by Father Duffy and others. All of that ended up stifling a real creative part of Catholic parishes, and led to the famous saying about the laity fell into a passive dependent position where their job was to pay, pray, and obey. We produced throughout the 20th century then a very passive laity. No longer, they didn't even think about hiring and firing a pastor. They didn't even think much about participating in the liturgy, or people didn't even go to communion very often for quite a while, and so on. And then I just point out some of the other things connected with World War I, what forced us to maybe develop more of our local clergy. World War II, turning point for Catholics, especially the GI Bill, which let many Catholics go to college who couldn't have gone, and those are the people then who made it economically in the country and moved to the suburbs, and thus we had all these new parishes starting. And then in the 1960s, of course, recent history, can't overestimate the election of John Kennedy and moving us out of the ghetto, thinking the parishes don't have to be defensive enclaves. Kennedy was educated in the secular world, and therefore many parents began to think that they could educate their children like that, send them to the public schools, get them into the Ivy League schools, and that's how you made it, and so on. And then, of course, Vatican II, which we're all familiar with, liturgical reform, and so on, many of the small group things. And then trying to say something about today, what we've got is a new situation. Parishes don't function as they did before. Before, they were the whole center point of Catholic life. They still are in some rural towns in Ohio, for example. Some rural towns in Ohio, the parish is still the place where you have your dances and all your social activities, and all your friends belong to the parish, and almost all your friends are Catholic, and your whole life is bound up in the parish. And now in the suburbs these days, a lot of that has changed, and what people look for from the parish is something different, to be sort of a spiritual oasis for them, a way of helping them to grow and develop so that they can take on responsibility in the world. We go take the shorty to priest, and we might take ourselves right back to the whole circuit rider mentality. You could say that what we're doing today is repeating our history of the 19th century. That is, the lay people, now when we get the shortage of priests again, now the lay people are in the same position they were in the 19th century. They got to take over. They often have to run things, make sure they happen, and the priest drives in now and then. Same as. It's already happening in a lot of places in the United States. I think I've used the example before, but I was doing a priest retreat in Covington, and one priest told me he had 3 or 4 parishes like that, drove 180 miles every weekend, just went from one to the other, said Mass, and jumped in his car and went to the next place. He is now the circuit rider, as the early priests were in the history of the United States. So we're now getting back, and it looks like history is repeating itself again. And we have this great burgeoning of lay ministry, interest in the lay people and feeling responsible for the church, and in many places just sort of taking over again. And the priest becomes like an adjunct to that whole operation. Well, let's take a couple-minute break here, 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and look at some theological perspectives and some practical suggestions.